Hello, I'm Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress. It is one of my great privileges to confer the Library of Congress's Prize for American Fiction every year during the National Book Festival. The Prize for American Fiction recognizes and celebrates writers, their body of work, and the power of their words. The theme of this year's festival, Books Bring Us Together, could not be more appropriate as we bring the festival back in person in Washington. And it also suitably describes the force of the books of the author we honor today. Jesmyn Ward is a singular presence in American literature. Throughout her novels, she values the stories of all Americans, especially the struggles of African Americans in the South, who are still suffering long after slavery. She connects readers to the piercing and urgent questions about racism and social injustice that Americans are facing today. Jesmyn is a voice for a new generation with her lyrical prose and sharp voice. She's a formidable writer who can stand tall next to and side by side with our nation's literary luminaries. It is our honor to present the 2022 Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction to Jesmyn Ward. As part of the 2022 National Book Festival, she will be in conversation with the Library of Congress Literary Director, Clay Smith. Clay?
Thanks, Dr. Hayden, and welcome, Jesmyn, to the 2022 National Book Festival. Thrilled to be here on the Writers Studio stage, sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts. Show us that award that Dr. Hayden sent to you.
Here it is. It's big and beautiful and ooh, the glare, but there it is. There it is.
Yeah. It is really beautiful. Well, you totally deserve it. So, yeah. So I mostly want to ask about your most recent novel, Sing Unburied Sing. But we'll talk about all kinds of things. And thanks again for being here. So one of the interesting things is that you have said in the past that your ideas for your novels always come to you in the form of a question. And I wondered if you remember what question came to mind for you when you were thinking about what would become Sing Unburied Sing.
Yeah, I do. I mean, so the question that came to mind for Sing Unburied Sing was basically the question of JoJo. Because I was wondering what it would be like. So the question was, what would it be like for a kid like this? You know, like a 13-year-old mixed race kid who is growing up in like very difficult circumstances. What would it be like for this kid to grow up, to come of age in the modern South, like in modern Mississippi? So that was the question I think that inspired me to follow JoJo into the world of Sing Unburied Sing. It took me a while to sort of get there, like to figure out who might be at the beginning of the book and who his family members were and exactly, I guess, what the setup was, like his family makeup um, and all the pressures that were sort of weighing on him. But once I got there, really, it was always like the hook was always his experience, right? Like this kid's experience, and that was what sort of led me into that world, and sort of pushed me through Mississippi with him.
Yeah, and you've written about you've had some of your characters reappear in subsequent books. What is it like for you in between books? I mean, are those characters still talking to you, or are you thinking about them?
I think about them all the time, but it's funny because I think that it's hard for me to age them. Like it's hard for me to follow them beyond, say, like a year out from where I left them at the end of the book. So for me, they're very much not frozen because they're dynamic and they're real, right? To me, but they're they live in the place where I wrote them, you know. So it's and in the situation where I wrote them into. So it's hard for me to, um, I guess, hear them outside of that timeline, outside of that place, and outside of that moment. Um, I'm always actually working on something new, and so maybe that's another reason why it's sort of hard for me to sort of pull my characters out of the world, you know, that I wrote them into, because I'm always in another world with a different set of characters, trying to understand exactly why they've, you know, drawn me to this moment, right? So yes, I'm usually sort of wrestling with a new world and a new cast of characters.
Yeah. You know, you grew up in DeLisle, Mississippi, in southern Mississippi, and you have left there, but you've returned and live near there now, I think. And you know, you have this fictional setting of Bois Sauvage, and you evoke it so well, and it's so detailed, and the reader really feels like they're there and that they know it. But I wondered if you've ever been tempted to set anything out that's not there.
You know, what's funny is that the novel that I've been working on for, God, the past, how long? 6 years, 7 years, is actually not set in Bois Sauvage. It's very different from anything that I've ever written, and it's the first novel that takes place totally outside of Bois Sauvage. Um, it's set in 1835. It follows an enslaved woman. It begins in South Carolina and follows her as she journeys south to New Orleans, to the slave markets of New Orleans, and then beyond the slave markets of New Orleans to the sugarcane plantation in Louisiana. So it's a total departure from basically everything that I've ever written uh, before. And really, I think part of the reason that I wanted to write this or felt called to write this particular book is because um, I I was listening to a radio show one day, this years and years ago, right? Because I've been working on this for 6 or 7 years now, and I was listening to a radio show, and on the radio show was about the slave markets of New Orleans, and specifically like slave pens in New Orleans. The fact that that there, I was listening to National Public Radio actually, um, but it's a local station, WWN, out of New Orleans, and they were saying that there aren't, at the time, again, this is 7 years ago, that there were only two markers uh, in the city where there were slave pens, and one of those markers was in the wrong location, right? Um, and so it was it, you know, and you know, keep in mind that there were dozens of slave pens in the city, right? And New Orleans was the capital of the domestic slave trade, and so it was just, as I was listening to this show and like driving to work, I took it to Lane, and like driving into the city, I was just sort of struck by the fact that this history, in some respects, had been erased, right? And I thought the question, right? So the question that popped in my head was, well, what if I write about it? Like, what if I um, follow a person, right, an enslaved person, and bring that like aspect of history back into the present, right, in a story. And so that's how I began working on that novel. Yeah, and so I think, you know, like much of my earlier work was like very invested in exploring Bois Sauvage as a place. And I still love that place, and I want to return there, right, in my future work, right? Um, but I think that something that has been motivating my work my more recent work is this need to uh, bring the past into the present and excavate the past and really find people who have been like silent and erased from history and write about them.
Yeah. No, it's so wonderful because I mean, you know, your readers who've been with you over the three novels I think that you've published know Bois Sauvage, and you know, you're sort of going backwards. I mean, you're going backwards in time, and so you're just going to give the reader a much fuller picture of where your imagination is coming from. So that'll be really exciting, I think, for readers. So. Any sense of when that one is coming out? You still working on
it? So right now I'm waiting for notes from my editor, Kathy Belden. And so I will probably spend the fall revising, you know, and incorporating her feedback into the novel. And so we're hoping, I think, that the book will come out in spring of 2024. So yeah, I think that's the timeline right now.
Yeah, we'd love to talk to you about it when it's out. You've worked with Kathy for a number of books now, right? You must have a pretty great editing relationship. It's such a sensitive thing for a writer.
Yeah, I love her. I mean, I am so grateful that I found her because she's a wonderful editor. She's uniquely able, I think, to read my work and understand what I'm trying to accomplish in my work, and then she tailors her feedback to help me accomplish whatever it is that I'm trying to accomplish. And she's you know, she's curious. She asks questions. She you know, she's not, I think I work better with editors who how do I phrase this? Who are curious and who do ask questions and who I think trust that if they ask me a question or if they give me this sort of puzzle to solve in the storytelling, that I'll be able to solve it, you know? And she does all of that. And she's just a very like insightful, you know, kind reader for my work. I love her very much, and I know that, you know, like my books, they are better for because of my relationship with her.
So Kathy is sort of talking back to you in your own language instead of her own language and insisting it be done her way. That's all you can ask for in a good editor. So, yeah. So back to Sing Unburied Sing. You know, you're doing something really interesting here because in the first bit of the novel, the first chapter is really told by Jojo, who you mentioned earlier, and he, you know, has some negative thoughts about his mother being sort of absent and not fulfilling that kind of mother role. And so then the next chapter, Leonie, his mother, takes over, and you know, you've done an interesting thing there for the reader where you're sort of stacking the cards against Leonie before we ever hear her own side of the story. And I wondered if you could just talk about that. You know, it's such a great choice, and I just wanted to hear more about why you set it up that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, I feel like I sort of began with Jojo as a default, right? Because he's the character who drew me to this world in this moment. And so, yeah, and so it just felt right to begin in his point of view. But, you know, I struggled with Leonie's perspective in the beginning of the writing process, like when I was drafting the rough draft, and struggled so much because I found myself judging her as a parent, right? and judging her so much that then I realized that I was doing a disservice to her character. Um, and so I had to actually stop working on the rough draft, pull back, and figure out exactly where her or attempts to figure out exactly like what was motivating her behavior, right? Um, what was at like the heart of her dysfunction, I think, her sort of lashing out. And so it took me a while, it took me like a week of just like sitting with her character, and thinking about her story and where she came from and what she'd seen in her life. And but eventually I figured out that she had a sibling who was killed in this terrible way. Um, his death was never sort of accounted for, like he was denied justice and death, and that was what was at the heart of her um, dysfunction, right? And so once I figured that out, then I dove back into the writing of the rough draft, and I think was able to um, come to her character from a place of compassion, right? And just like, and love her in the way that I love all my characters. And that's something about me. I don't know if, I mean, different writers work in different ways, but I've always loved all of my characters. So I really had to do a lot of work to get to a point with her, where I sort of moved past judgment and sort of understood like the root of her sort of pain, right? So that I was able to come from a place of love and like compassion and empathy, right, for her. And I was like particularly interested, I think, in writing from her perspective because I feel like again, like she is the kind of person who is who we tell who we tell stories about and who their narrative is about, right? In like popular culture, right? But that kind of person is seldom able to tell their own story, right? And so I was like super invested in giving her the opportunity, right, to speak in her own words and sort of tell the reader, you know, open sort of open up her perspective, right, and align the reader with her perspective so that the reader feels real sympathy, real empathy, um, for her. And that's something, you know, I didn't realize it until I wrote her character, but it's something that I feel like I'm also invested in doing in my work because I think about a character like Esh from Salvage the Bones, right? Who is like another type of person, you know, young, you know, pregnant, poor, black 15-year-old, right? Who, or teen, black teen, right? Who I think that there are a lot of conversations about and who we have lots of narratives about. But but that kind of person, I don't think that kind of person rarely gets the opportunity to tell their own stories, right? And so, yeah, so I feel like that's something that I'm invested in doing.
Yeah. Well, you do a great job of it. I mean, Leonie has such a complex sort of soul, like a complex interior life in this novel. And, you know, for me, that fact brings up this question of research and fiction and what the limits of research and fiction are, because you have a character who, you know, is sort of haunted, as anyone would be, by his experience at the sort of notorious Parchman prison farm. And you also, you know, you have talked about in interviews in the past about knowing people in southern Mississippi who are battling addiction, and you cover that in this novel. And so I just wanted to ask you about, you know, to the degree to which you do research on these two topics in particular, addiction and Parchman, and when you have to leave, when you have to set the research down and start imagining.
Mm-hmm. Right. Um, yeah, I mean, I think my research about addiction was, I think, mostly informed by, as you said, like personal experience and sort of familiarity with with uh, my with growing up in a place where lots of the people that I know, right, in my sort of poor, working class, Black rural community were struggling with addiction, with all types of addiction, right? Um, so I think that my writing around addiction was like informed by personal experience, and by sort of what I see and saw around me. Um, with When I was writing about Parchment Prison, I definitely had to do a ton of research because I realized when I was sort of working on the rough draft, I had this moment where I realized, wait, I know little to nothing about Parchment Prison. I did have some, sort of relatives in my extended family who had been incarcerated in Parchment Prison, and sort of I interviewed them and talked to them about their experiences. But that didn't tell me everything that I needed to know, and so yeah, and so I had to research. I had to, find books specifically about Parchment Prison, and about incarceration, and read those. And I'm really grateful for those books because those books then led me to other characters in the book, and specifically, Richie's character. So the character of the 13-year-old boy um, who is a ghost, right, in the present moment, but who was in Parchment Prison in the 1940s with JoJo's grandfather. Um, and I, was sort of shocked by what I learned while I was doing the research, because I didn't know that kids like Richie existed, right? I didn't know that children, were sent to Parchment Prison for things that really shouldn't even have been, categorized as crimes. And then basically in Parchment Prison, at least in the 30s, 40s, 50s, they were basically re-enslaved. Um, and so I was just shocked, that that if I hadn't gone looking for that information, I would have gone my whole life without knowing, that kids like him existed. And so again, I think that I felt that sense of sort of injustice at this idea, and that children like Richie had suffered, and that their suffering and that the truth of their experience had basically been erased from the historical narrative. And so I wanted to write about it, because I wanted to bring him into the present moment, and for that research that I'd done to live in a way, um, in my reader's imagination, right, and in the public imagination.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you more about that because Richie, is 12, I think, in the novel, and is a ghost, and he's all he wants to do is rest. He's sort of haunted by being haunting, I guess, and he doesn't get that rest. And the question seems obvious, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why does he not get that rest?
So there are a couple of reasons in the book, I think, that answer that question of like why he doesn't get any rest. Um, so while I was researching, I found this quote, and it was not very specific. It wasn't attributed to a specific, tribe, um, in Africa, but I came across this quote um, that said that there was a saying, um, in a certain tribe in Africa where if that how does it go? Like that there are moments, um, when people die in such a terrible way, right, that even God has to turn his face away. And I just remember being struck by that by that quote and by that idea. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that Richie can't rest is because he died in such a terrible manner, right? That even like the divine had to turn their face away. Um, and so that's one reason that he sort of haunts the world, right? Um, and then I think that another reason that he can't rest is because he can't recall how he died, and so that's one of the things that he wants from Pop, from River. He wants the story of how he died, right? So that he can have some sort of understanding, I think, of what happened to him, and perhaps that can answer the question of why he's bound to this place, right? And why he can't sort of move on. And then I think the third reason I think that he can't rest is because, um, like one of the ideas that I had been sort of thinking about and exploring recently is like this idea of sort of ancestor veneration, right? Yeah, and so this idea that uh, that people in the present are sort of aware and sort of honor the people that came before them, right? And sort of honor their ancestors, right? And in a way that's, I mean, it's an expression of sort of love and gratitude, right, for the people that came before you. And it's also sort of um, uh, a way to sort of channel your grief, I think, and channel that love that you feel for the people that you've lost. Um, and and so, in at least in this world, in the world of the book, I think that the ancestors and those who have gone before, like they are aware of that sort of love, right? And I think, unfortunately for Richie, that that he was unloved in life. I mean, the when sort of I discovered his family on the page, his mom and his siblings, like he was a neglected child, you know. And I think that his relationship with River was really important to him, JoJo's grandfather, because I think that he looked up to River in some ways. River was like a big brother to him, right? And he loved him. He felt love and sort of a sense of caring from River. Um, and I think he's hungry for that, as in death, right? And I think that's another reason why it's difficult for him to move on, because he doesn't feel that love anymore. And in a way, I think he's sort of searching for it.
I just have a few more questions. I want to ask you. There's a sort of incident of police brutality in this novel. It's sort of a real life narrative that has become, very familiar in the news. And I just wondered what does it feel like for you to sort of think and feel your way into a scene like that?
It was difficult. I mean, I think because I was aware of all the ways that moment could have gone tragically, terribly wrong, right? Um, and just like that awareness of that fact, right? That JoJo in that moment could have been, yet another, dead child, right? Um, and but then it's a completely different book, right? And I don't know, as I was sort of writing my way through that moment, it was really harrowing. I mean, it's different because I have never experienced that, right? But in a way, I think that sense of danger, of like near and present danger, and that sense of terror sort of faintly echoed, I think, what I felt when I was writing about Hurricane Katrina and Salvage the Bones, right? Which I do have personal experience with. Um, but just that sense of like being on the cusp of a moment where everything can change for the worst, right? Where your world can be completely unmade. Um, uh, I think that that was very, I was very aware of that in that moment of writing about, you know, the JoJo's brush with law enforcement.
Tell us, are there any younger writers newer writers that you think we all should be reading that you're excited about?
Yeah, I am. So I, um, he's not younger than me. I think he's like maybe a year older than me. But I always love to bring him up in conversation because he's a fellow Mississippian, and adore his work. I love his work. But Kiese Layman, definitely, um, who uh, who just well, he came out with a memoir a couple of years ago named Heavy, which is amazing, um, and which made me cry for like the first like 30 pages straight. I was just sobbing. It was that it resonated with me that strongly. And then he just reissued a novel named Long Division, um, which is also amazing. There's another writer named Brian Washington who wrote, I haven't read everything that he's written. He has come out with a short story collection called Lot, which I love. It's set in Houston. He's a Southern writer. Um, uh, and I think he's a Southern Black queer writer, right? And all of his stories are set in like different neighborhoods in Houston, and they are sort of raw and tender, but then also have a touch of the surreal about them, and just really dynamic. I really love that collection. And then there's a writer who I do not know again if she's younger than I am. She might be. Her name is Chanel Benz. She wrote a novel called The Gone Dead, and it is also set in Mississippi. I think she has Southern roots. I don't know her specific. I'm giving you a lot of Black Southern writers today. Um, but she wrote this novel that's set in the Delta, and it's all about sort of a character returning home to the Delta in order to sort of deal with her father's affairs, and he is he is deceased, right? So she returns, to his home, right? She grew up elsewhere. She returns to his home to the Delta. Just the way that she writes about the Delta, there were so many moments where I just had that, um, like the shock of recognition, sort of the shock of recognition of like the Delta and the people that she is writing about, but also like the joy and the pleasure of that, of recognizing like the familiarity of that place and of those characters. It's a really great book. So that's another writer who I've sort of read recently. I would love all those writers on everyone's radar because they're all fantastic.
Yeah, so that's Kiese Layman, Brian Washington, and Chanel Benz. Isn't that Chanelle?
I think that's how you spell it. Yeah. Chanelle.
And Benz. So everybody in the audience, you have your reading assignments.
Right.
Thanks so much, Jasmine, for talking with us and for being our new Prize for American Fiction honoree. We're so proud to have you involved with the library. And thank you to everybody for attending today. And this is the start of the festival. Please go out and discover some writers and have an excellent day.
Thank you.